This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 55. Nicely in person for this episode, as you can see. Starting off today is a question from Daff and Shane from Canada, who ask, what's up with the gray matter decrease and white matter increase during pregnancy? How does this impact behavior? Is this change to the detriment of the pregnant person? What does it mean in an evolutionary context?
Well, first off, before I answer the question, I just want to say, Daff and Shane, insofar as you guys are our neighbors to the north, we are immensely sorry for the madness that our government is doing to you. But that said, can now look at the question, this question of what happens to the brain during pregnancy. And what's being referred to is a very flashy landmark paper that was published back in December. Prestigious journal, Nature Neuroscience, collaborative team of scientists, University of California, Irvine, and UC Santa Barbara, showing really interesting things that happen to the human brain during pregnancy. Now, before telling that, I needed to tell about one of my favorite things about pregnancy in rats and rats. And this was a study some years ago. Okay, the adult brain, everyone used to think doesn't make neurons, new neurons, adult neurogenesis. We've talked about that in here. A revolutionary finding that you will make new neurons in the hippocampus, having to do with forming new memories. And all along, there was one other outpost in the nervous system where you would make new neurons during adulthood. And this was in the olfactory bulb, the main sensor there for olfaction. And the remarkable observation, like the first thing anyone ever figured out as to when you made new neurons in your olfactory bulb in rats, is when you become pregnant. This huge renovation project in the olfactory bulb, you would have programmed cell death killing of the neurons already there and making these new neurons from progenitor stem cells, as they're called. And this whole renovation project is so that right around the time she gives birth, a female rat has a spanking new olfactory bulb. What's that good for? An immensely cool additional finding, which is she's got this brand new olfactory system just in time to imprint on the odor of her newborns. And if you block that process, she doesn't connect with them as much. So that is cool about rats. Currently, it is unknown if the same thing happens in humans. But back to this paper about humans. It's already known, a bunch of studies looking at the brains of women before and after pregnancy. And what that literature has shown is something pretty consistent, which is there's shrinkage of the brain. In particular, shrinkage of the gray matter, which is, well, cell bodies are found gray matter, as opposed to white matter, which are the cables connecting different sections of gray matter. There's shrinkage of gray matter, in particular in the cortex and some other spots in the brain, what are termed subcortical regions, hippocampus, hypothalamus, something called the nucleus accumbens, which has something to do with reward, something called the default mode network, all of which we've talked about in here. So that was great, but those studies lacked a certain refinement in that all you knew was about before and after. What made this study amazing was one incredibly committed volunteer who volunteered to be brain scanned and blood samples for hormone levels over and over throughout her pregnancy, starting before pregnancy. This person underwent IVF, so it was possible to know when the pregnancy was going to start with any luck. So you have this detailed record for the first time, total state of the art brain imaging stuff to get really fine tuned pictures as to when exactly during pregnancy these different brain changes were occurring. And again, the general theme was in some of these areas, there was a continuous decrease in gray matter volume in the cortex. In some other areas, it was more in particular parts of pregnancy and such. But this was just the most detailed sort of confirmation that there's this atrophy, there's this shrinkage of parts of the brain during pregnancy. Okay, what is that about? What's causing that? First thing is during pregnancy, there's these caves of fluid inside the brain called ventricles filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And one of the things that's seen is during pregnancy, the ventricles get larger. The ventricles get larger. This, for example, is seen in hydrocephalus, where you increase the total amount of cerebral spinal fluid in the ventricles, and the ventricles expand, and as a result, they squish the brain tissue, particularly the cortex, lying on each side of the ventricles. So maybe that's all that was happening here. This is not actually a loss of brain tissue. This is just the ventricles get bigger during pregnancy and they squish, and this is an artifact of squishing. And it looks like that's not the case because indeed the ventricles get bigger in pregnancy. But what they saw was that the ventricles go back to normal size within a couple of months after delivery, but these brain changes are there for years afterward. All of the studies, both this one as well as the set of before and afters, show that these are persistent changes for years. So, not just an artifact of cerebral spinal fluid. Another idea is rather than thinking about this being changes in the brain in preparation for motherhood, these are changes in preparation for parturition, giving birth. But that one goes down the tubes as soon as you consider, once again, these differences are lasting for years after giving birth. They're very long lasting. And what the field is getting around to is seeing these are changes about maternal behavior, not so much the process of going through labor. So, maternal behavior. What else might be explaining this? Hormones. Hormones, where you see thousand-fold differences in levels of hormones like estrogen and progesterone over the course of pregnancy, with delivery and the aftermath, dramatic changes of these hormones that have effects all over the brain and have effects on maternal behavior related stuff. For example, there's a part of the hypothalamus called the medial preoptic area, which has something to do with maternal behavior. And estrogen and progesterone sharpen its responsiveness so that you're responding to your kid and not some random stuffy or something that looks like a baby. So it could be hormones. Okay, so we get a little bit of a sense of the mechanisms for this here. And these are long lasting changes where there's shrinkage of gray matter and some subtle changes in the white matter. Okay, so this brings us to a potentially difficult moment. So, pregnancy causes your brain to atrophy. What every paper on this subject goes out of its way to say is this has nothing to do with the mostly mythic but somewhat true phenomenon of mommy brain distraction, loss of concentration, cognitive challenges, and such. And the literature suggests it's overwhelmingly due to stress and sleep deprivation. This has nothing to do with this. Nonetheless, we've got this sort of disquieting finding of the brain seemingly undergoes shrinkage of some pretty important areas. The gray matter, the part where the cell bodies are, the neuronal cell bodies in the cortex, a cool, desirable part of the brain, and in a bunch of these subcortical structures. Uh-oh, that sounds like a picture of your brain kind of takes a beating during pregnancy and doesn't work as well afterward. And this brings us to one of the great counterintuitive things about brain development. So, by all logic, when do you have the most neurons in your brain? Obviously, like on the morning of your 21st birthday, that's where brain maturation has peaked. And from there on out, you are declining from there. And that's a logical picture. That is not what you see at all. Instead, you see the most neurons in the brain just around adolescence. And all that happens during adolescence is you're pruning away useless connections and useless neurons. You're getting a brain that's leaner and meaner, that is more efficient, whose pathways are more focused, all of that. Brain maturation during adolescence is shrinking the brain to make for more focused connections there. So that immediately has us thinking differently about the fact that the brain is doing the same thing during pregnancy. So, what is this about? What you see is connectiveness in some of these white matter pathways gets strengthened during pregnancy. For example, this connection between the visual cortex in the back of the head and the hypothalamus. What's that about? You are getting very attuned to your baby's face. That may be the equivalent of getting a whole new olfactory system. This is for visual recognition of your offspring. Another change is particularly interesting. One of the most dramatic changes is in this area called the default mode network. Again, we've talked about it, and it's an area of it that has to do with self referential behavior and autobiographical reflection. Think about yourself. Think about what you think about yourself when you're thinking about yourself. Self refer. Whoa, this makes no sense at all. The part of the brain that undergoes the most dramatic changes during pregnancy are the part of the brain where you are referring to yourself. What's that about? All you have to do is see the first time you have a woman cut her finger and get an owie there. And for the rest of the day, her toddler is walking around holding their finger because they have an owie there also. Ego boundaries break down by the time you have a newborn. Self referential is both about yourself and your baby. And what you also see is sharpening of a part of the brain, a system that does theory of mind, where you get better at viewing the world from somebody else's perspective. And you better bet there's a particular individual whose perspective you were focusing the most on. So, this very cool finding, simply a much more detailed picture of this general theme of, ooh, the brain shrinks during pregnancy. The brain gets rid of all the fat and extraneous stuff and slims down to the stuff that it really needs, having to do with sensory recognition of your offspring, having to do with the intensity of your bonding with your offspring, having to do with your ability to take their perspective in the world. And as evidence that this is the case, you look across these studies of groups of women during pregnancy before and after, and the more these brain changes occur, that correlates with, that predicts greater bonding with your offspring. So that's a really interesting story. And of course, I don't know, 49% of the population at this point might ask, does this happen in fathers at all over the course of this? And the basic answer is no.
Okay, next, Andrew from Ohio says, with the passing of Phil Zimbardo this past fall, it seems like the appropriate question to ask: what happened in the Stanford Prison Experiment from a neuroscience perspective? Was the experiment worth it?
Phil Zimbardo, who died last year at age 91, Stanford colleague of mine, psychologist, one of the most renowned psychologists of the last century, most famous, most heavily cited, most controversial in lots of realms. And much of what his fame and notoriety was about was the Stanford Prison Experiment, one of the textbook, literally textbook psychology studies destined to be in psych textbooks for the rest of time. Lots of people are aware of it. Incredibly influential. The main paper that was published about it has been cited a mind boggling 60,000 times in the literature, and your average paper gets cited like 4.5 times, and three of them are from the author's mother. This is one of the most influential psychology papers ever studied. Not only that, but it was made into a movie. It's been made into all sorts of, follow up versions of it and such. It took place in 1971. 24 young men, mostly students, but not entirely so. 24 young men volunteered for the study, in which 12 of them were randomly assigned to be prisoners in this prison that was set up in the basement of the psych building at Stanford, and 12 of them were going to be guards. And they were let loose on each other. And as everybody knows, it was sheer madness and bedlam, and the guards became brutal and savage. And by the third day, they had killed and cannibalized all 12 of the prisoners. That's kind of what urban myths have done with that study by now. What actually happened was much subtler, but considerably more interesting. Okay, so 12 individuals randomly assigned to be prisoners, 12 as guards. The prisoners What they thought was they were going to show up at the psych department, Monday morning to begin this interesting experiment that was supposed to last for a couple of weeks. And instead, dripping with authenticity, Zimbardo got the Palo Alto police to cooperate with him. The police went and picked up these 12 young men, these 12 volunteers destined to become prisoners, came and, as far as the neighbors were concerned, came and arrested them. They took them to the police station, fingerprinted them, mug shots, strip searched them, and dumped them in the basement of the psych building into what was set up to be a 3-cell prison, 4 prisoners in each of the cells. So this was major shocker for these individuals who thought they were going for some nice, interesting experiment, and they're arrested in front of their neighbors and they're dumped into this prison cell. The guards, meanwhile, the guards were dressed in khaki with reflective sunglasses, and all they were told by Zimbardo was, you can't be violent, but you could do anything else you want to the prisoners. And they humiliated them. They deprived them of food. They deprived them of sleep. They made them do punitive exercises. They made them use a bucket instead of being able to go to the bathroom. They wouldn't call them by their names, just by their numbers. Harassment, humiliation. And what you began to see was, within a day or two, the prisoners began to disintegrate. Some of them falling apart, some of them beginning to resist. By the second day, one of the 3 cells basically rioted and barricaded their way in there, and the guards had to come in with fire extinguishers and subdue them. By the third day, most of the prisoners had transitioned to being depressed, despondent, completely helpless and lethargic, and this was getting worse and worse by each day. And next famous feature of the study, on day 6, this was so bad at this point, and the state of mind seemingly of the prisoners, that famously Zimbardo's grad student, someone named Christina Maslish, came and told him, this is crazy, this is inhumane, this is a disaster, you have to stop this. And 2 things came as a result of that. He listened to her and stopped the 2-week study on day 6, and they wound up getting married for 50 years afterward or so. So that was the Stanford Prison Experiment. And what was the general theme, the general conclusion? Look at the barbarity of these guards within a couple of days. As a lesser theme, look at sort of the psychological collapse of the prisoners. And all along, there's always been this theme of one bad apple has the potential to ruin a whole bunch of happy apples. And what Zimbardo pulled out of it was something like the role of guards in a prison is the case of a bad barrel. And fill up a bad barrel with good apples, and they're going to turn bad. And this was a case of this. And this creepy, unsettling demonstration of the potential for depraved indifference to human suffering. Not surprisingly, importantly, Zimbardo was one of the sort of expert witnesses when trying to make sense of the abuses that went in the Abu Ghraib prison from American soldiers with prisoners there. And this was the take home message of the Stanford Prison Experiment. Everybody learned, there's a heart of darkness and even these randomly selected 12 volunteers, and they descended into savagery within days. Naturally, there were all sorts of criticisms of the study, and the single biggest one was something that Zimbardo did, which was not being, Mr. Machine Scientist 101 and just be an objective observer. He gave himself a role in this. He was the prison warden. So that at the end of each day, he met with the guards and they reviewed sort of problematic prisoners who were talking back and what was needed to be done. And he was the warden. And Zimbardo was a very nice man. You and your brother got some children's books that he and Christina gave us when you guys were born. A very nice man, but he was one of the larger than life personalities, a gigantic presence, charismatic as hell, All you wanted was for him to notice you and like you, and all that these guards were doing was trying to do whatever they thought he wanted them to do. And no doubt on some implicit level, they were picking up cues like crazy of him getting excited and, whoa, this is totally amazing what's happening here. And that was sort of the big confound. And probably what the Stanford Prison Experiment was mostly showing was the effects of a really powerful, charismatic leader on people who want to please him and be noted by him. So, of course, that's what the finding was. These guards falling into depraved indifference, and these were random individuals as to who was a prisoner, who was a guard. In terms of the group, interestingly, the majority of the volunteers wanted to be prisoners. This was towards the end of the Vietnam War, and a number of them thought this is going to be training for me when I'm in prison as a conscientious objector or arrested in some sort of anti war protest. And as many of these individuals wound up being randomized to being guards as prisoners, and these people came out of it fairly traumatized. Not just the guards, they had no idea they were capable of that sort of indifference, but the prisoners as well. They had no idea they were capable of collapsing inward so rapidly. It was really, really striking effects on these, and they changed careers, they changed life trajectories as a basis of what they discovered about themselves in those 6 days. Okay, so that's the findings in the Stanford Prison Experiment. And of course, what you're supposed to ask at that point is, has it been replicated? And this is where things get really interesting. There has been one fairly exact replication of it that was carried out a few years ago by the BBC Prison Experiment, where 24 volunteers were recruited, and once again they were randomized, and the whole thing was filmed, and it was going to be exactly the same. What was one big difference? There was no one like Zimbardo acting as the warden. What was another big difference? There were cameras everywhere. There was this consciousness that everybody was on display in there. But otherwise, they were given the same instructions that the guards were. They went through all the same hazing. Everything was done the same. And then they were let loose in this version of it. And what you saw was something totally different. Within a few days, the prisoners had organized into basically an equivalent of civil disobedience. Within a few days after that, the guards were all demoralized by the prisoners' organized resistance. Within a few days of that, the entire structure had fallen apart, and driven by the prisoners, a co op had been set up where chores and duties and responsibilities were shared equally by the guards and the prisoners. Euphoria, utopia. This is totally great, it turned out. And within a few days after that, 3 prisoners and 1 guard, who eventually were shown in personality profiles to have the most authoritarian personalities, had taken over the entire thing and instituted basically a reign of terror. So this was not so much a model for the SPE, the Stanford Prison Experiment, as for the FRE or the RRE, the French Revolution experiment or the Russian Revolution experiment. You get a period where these beautiful sheep ready to be slaughtered idealists briefly get some sort of nice commune going, and then the sociopaths take over. Okay, so what else was interesting about that study? One of the points that was made in the original Stanford study was the 24 volunteers were given personality profiles, and by all the standard measures, when they were randomized into prisoners and guards, there were no significant differences. That's great. That's great. But it occurred to the BBC people to look for one additional control. Not only would they want to know if the two groups differed in terms of personality, but they would want to know if 24 people who would volunteer for this were different from the general population. So they did an additional interesting experiment. They put an ad in the newspaper with the same exact wording as the one for the original Stanford Prison Experiment, which was volunteers needed to do a experiment on prison life. Or they put an ad in with all the same wording, but not mentioning prison. And what they saw was they got two very different groups of volunteers. And the ones who wanted to be in a quote prison experiment, it turned out on personality profiles, they were more authoritarian, they were more hierarchical, they got more comfort from social order, they were more aggressive. And so almost certainly this was not truly a random bunch of individuals who would have volunteered for this. That was very informative. Okay, so nonetheless, with all these qualifiers, now two ultimately very different versions of this experiment, what they both showed was something very informative nonetheless in the most streamlined version of the findings. In all sorts of circumstances, people who otherwise would view themselves and the world would view them as humane and kind and responsible and all of that have potential horrors lurking underneath the surface. And in all sorts of unexpected circumstances, individuals who might think of themselves as brave and resilient as backbones and fighting the man turned out to crumble under that sort of stressor. So, not everyone, and there's always glorious exceptions to sort of oppression like this producing passivity in the oppressed. There are always ones who are going to resist gloriously, and there's always going to be equivalents of the prison guards who refuse to go along with it. But the broadest outcome is people are capable of a whole lot more social conformity than anyone might have been comfortable with guessing beforehand.
So finally, Yazan from Denmark asks, do you have an evolutionary explanation for the practice of male circumcision? And is there any similar rite or ritual seen in other primates?
Well, great question. I've been waiting for this question for months now. First off, nothing resembling circumcision is found in any other species, but it is widespread, but importantly, not universal in humans. First off, when it's done in the West, and I have not kept track of whether the incidence is increasing or decreasing or holding steady, but there's a fair amount of it done in the West. And the standard Western medical model as to why circumcision is a good idea is it's good for health. It decreases transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, HSV, herpes simplex virus, urinary tract infections, going from in both directions, man and woman. And what you see is the main vector for that being bad for health is the foreskin apparently is a reservoir for bacteria to build up in and things I don't really want to think about right now. But it actually remains quite controversial in the West as to whether this is something recommended in the United States versus in the European Union versus the World Health Organization. Different opinions, different advice as to whether or not one should circumcise one's newborn son. Okay, so that's the issue of circumcision in the West, but this is an old practice among humans, and thus the question about the evolution of circumcision. And I think much more so than the traditional sense of evolution, the genetics of why we evolved doing this, it is very non-random where you find circumcision around the world, and thus the question becomes much more interestingly one about cultural evolution. What sort of cultures evolved ritualistic circumcision? Whether newborns or adolescents or anything in between, it's not random who you see it in. Okay, so many moons ago in these episodes, I'm fairly sure we talked about in traditional human populations, there's basically three different ways you can make your living. You could be a hunter-gatherer, which has been the oldest one around, 99% of human history, blah, blah. You could be a farmer, 10, 15,000 years old, and that's become the dominant sort of lifestyle, traditional lifestyle on Earth. Or you could be a nomadic pastoralist, which are the people who, once we started domesticating beasties into turning into camels and goats and cows and yaks and reindeer, there emerged this whole other way of making a living, which is being nomadically pastoral with your herds and living off of their milk, living off of their meat, blood, all of that. So these three broad dichotomies: hunter gatherers, farmers, and nomadic pastoralists. And it turns out it's the nomadic pastoralists where you not only see much higher than expected rates of circumcision, much higher than expected rates of clitorectomies of girls as well. And it actually makes a lot of sense. So, what goes on in the life of nomadic pastoralists with their herds of cows and camels and whatever at certain times of year? The range or three mountain ranges over that way, the local conditions change, whatever. A frequent feature of these folks is that at various points, men will pick up and take their herds days away to better grazing land, being away for weeks on end. And what you see then is a tremendous amount of cultural anxiety about the fidelity of wives back home when men have to be away for long stretches of time. And a standard sort of argument is that clitorectomies emerged in these cultures with pastoralist men away for long stretches of time to make sure that sex was a whole lot less pleasurable for women, decreasing the likelihood of some guy being cuckolded when he's out there with his camels and back of beyond. And this sort of fed into a wonderful myth of European history. Another time where men picked up and disappeared for long periods, not because they were being nomadic pastoralists, but during the Crusades, the Crusaders who picked up and disappeared far away. And there was lots of cultural anxiety that this guy was leaving his wife behind while he was off to slaughter defenseless peasants in the name of Christianity. And that gave rise to what is almost entirely a myth of the invention of the chastity belt. And supposedly, a woman was locked in a chastity belt, and her husband took the key when he went off to lay siege to Jerusalem or something. And I think the general sense is that was a historical myth. Okay, so you see high rates of clitorectomies in nomadic pastoralist cultures. And the argument there is it has much to do with the fact that men are away a lot of the time and they want to make the notion of extramarital sex a lot less pleasurable for women. What about circumcisions? And that fits into the nomadic picture as well. So you are a nomad, and what that means is you spend 40 years wandering through the Sinai, or you spend long periods wandering through places and passing other groups, passing other tribes, passing other communities, a lot of them settlements, agriculturists, things like that. And there is the inevitable pull towards the grass is greener. Whoa, those folks look like they're living a whole lot more comfortable life. Maybe I should defect. Maybe I should go join them. And the notion is that if you are a nomadic pastoralist, you're really not going to be able to easily pick up and suddenly become one of those farmers because you forever have something that marks you from the tribe you come from. And there's no covering that, and there's no hiding that, if you want to poke around a bit, that this is something that ties you to your tribe forever after. You're never going to fool anybody trying to pass yourself off as part of some other group there. And what you see is different versions of different stylistic features of circumcision in different cultures. It's a way to mark you. So you might as well stick with your team as you wander through the wastelands because you're not going to be able to make it in some other tribe because they're going to know you're not one of them. And this like brings to mind this joke. Okay, elderly, very religious, traditional Jewish woman back in the old country in her village, and her son has grown up and moved to America and and he comes back for a visit and he's transformed. He's changed his name to an American name and he's shaved off his beard, and she discovers he's no longer keeping kosher rules, and she discovers he's just some businessman instead of studying the holy books. And oh my God, it turns out his wife is Episcopalian, and they have two kids and their names are like Chad and Brittany or something instead of Shmuel. And the mother is horrified and finally says, "Are you still circumcised at least?" Circumcision is forever in this view. So, this motif that you see in different types of religions is the job that you have in being a booster for your religion to attract new people to join or to retain members who are part of it. And what you see is nomadic cultures come up with religions where what it's about is retaining people, because it's mighty tempting to slip off and go where the grass is perhaps greener, and they are about retention. Judaism, for example, is about retention, all of it built around stick with us. And oh my God, there is such a great outcome that God has promised at the other end. In contrast, Christianity is a recruitment religion. It's about, whoa, this amazing thing happened to this guy, and then he rolled away the rock even though he was dead, and the good news, and why don't you come and join us? You see very different rituals, very different mindsets of religions that are about retaining members and religions that are about recruiting newcomers. And nomadic pastoralists are about retaining, and a great way to make sure nobody is ever going to try to make it in some other tribe over there is to mark them permanently. And that's one of the explanations for why you have this propensity towards circumcision among nomadic pastoralists, along with the propensity towards clitorectomies.
Well, in case anyone is wondering, this was sort of typical dinner conversation in this household growing up here. Um, and that's episode 55. Keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky. This is Safi Sapolsky. And thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.